Good morning and welcome to the Future Ventures podcast. My guest today is a global food and food tech investor who spent 25 years on the ground across Southeast Asia before moving to Amsterdam to help build one of the most respected alternative protein funds in the world. As managing partner for Europe and Asia at Unovis Asset Management, Anders Odhner has backed some of the most consequential companies in the food system, from Beyond Meat and Oatly to cultivated meat pioneers like Mosa Meat and Aleph Farms. He's been investing in this space since before most people knew it had a name. Kim, welcome to the Future Ventures podcast on Scaling with Clarity.
Thank you, Max. It's a pleasure to be here.
Same here. I've been looking forward to having a conversation with you for a very long time. As you know, our company name is Future Ventures, so we're building out this series on the future of life sciences, future food, and so I'm super excited about the conversation today and get your perspectives on kind of like, what does the future of food look like? How are we going to continue 8 billion people in a sustainable way? So why don't we just kind of start with who you are, Kim? How did you come to venture? What makes you tick?
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity, Max. So I'm, as you say, Kim Odhner. I'm based in Amsterdam. I'm American by birth. A number of years ago, in seeking out adventure, my wife and I moved to Southeast Asia in about 1995, landed in Hong Kong, and then from there went down to Vietnam. And while in Vietnam, I was working with an investment firm out of Hong Kong that had a couple of projects that they had seeded there. And so I was one of the earliest investors in the newly emerging Vietnam of the day. And my background really from that point forward was really emerging markets, private equity. So a lot of the work that I've done over the course of my career has really been, even if the checks were larger, it was fairly early stage and involved a tremendous amount of hands-on investment, but then post-investment activity. So that's the kind of investor that I've become over the years. I stayed in Southeast Asia and worked really across the region for a number of years, and then relocated to the United States in 2016. And when I came back to the U.S., I reconnected with an old friend, a guy named Chris Kerr. And Chris had just been given the mandate to set up the New Crop Capital Trust, and was looking for some experienced help to get that fund launched and start investing in some of the companies that you mentioned. And so that's really how I got from more of a private equity background into the venture space. And at the time, I really wanted to do something that was a little bit more meaningful, where the work that we were doing was somehow contributing something back. So that's kind of how I got involved initially.
And so, who is the founder, the creator of Unovis? Is it Chris? Because my understanding from kind of doing my prep was that the first fund one was like about $50 million, and then the fund two is $150 million. And so, was he kind of the driving force behind the creation of the funds?
Sure. Okay. So that first fund really only had one single LP, and that LP had a kind of a philanthropic bent. And our mission at the time, our mandate, if you will, was to go out and change the narrative around our dependence on animal agriculture. And so that was a fairly broad mandate, and particularly at a time when there weren't too many companies that were actually investing in alternative proteins. And so when we went out and we were looking for opportunities, we frequently found that we were the only investors in the room. So that gave us, early access to some of the companies that you had mentioned earlier, companies like Mosa Meat, Upside Foods. These companies, at the time had very little, if any, sponsorship that was sort of from the private sector. And so So it gave us a lot of a lot of opportunity to learn, a lot of opportunity to sort of influence the initial outcome of some of these companies. So it's a pretty exciting time.
And so, but if we just kind of peel the corporate, pierce the corporate veil, like who is Kim Anna, and like what do you like to do? Like what kind of drives you? Like family, kids?
I'm married. I have two children. They're fairly grown by now. I've got a daughter who's 23. She's living in Colorado, and I've got a son. He's just turned 20, and he's based in New Orleans. He's studying music, and she's studying international affairs. So
okay. So sounds like the daughter is following in your footsteps, and the son is being more on the creative side.
Yeah, well, I come from sort of a creative family. A lot of musicians in my family. Unfortunately, I didn't. That talent didn't sort of. But my children are both quite creative. So.
I'm totally innovation.
Yeah. Well, I guess my creativity is
different.
You know, mine was more on the adventure side. So we, in the course of our lives, my wife and I have lived in Philadelphia and in New York City for about 5 years. We lived in we lived in Hanoi. We lived in Saigon. We lived in Hong Kong. We lived in Singapore, Malaysia, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and now Amsterdam. So kind of traveled around the world a bit, and that's something that I really enjoy. Sorry?
Is there a favorite city for you, or you all love them differently?
Yeah. I mean, I used to say that Hong Kong was one of my favorite cities in the world.
Okay.
And I think it was, attributable to a really exciting time in my life. It was a great place to hike. There was a lot of outdoor activities, right proximal to the city itself. So there was a lot of energy and dynamism. Hanoi was a really fascinating place at a really interesting time. Saigon is a very energetic city. Food's great. It's risky crossing the road now on foot. Singapore was a really wonderful place to live for a period of time, particularly when having young children. It's a crossroads. People from all over the world are in Singapore, pursuing opportunities throughout Southeast Asia, and so as a result, it is a really dynamic place to be from a personal perspective. I like Mumbai in India. It's a fascinating city, also very, very energetic. And then here in the Netherlands, it's been a real pleasure living here in the Netherlands and having the opportunity to explore more of Europe. It's been an interesting journey, that's for sure.
Yeah, they all have different things to offer. So, in terms of if we're just going to shift gears a little bit and talk about food, and given that you've lived in so many different places in the world, where do you see food and food tech evolving, and how are we going to feed the world's population, and in what ways? I mean, in some parts of the world, alternative protein is really, really common. In North America, it's not as much, even though it's increasingly so. I was talking to Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, who is a professor at Dalhousie University, and he just recently published a report on global agri-food. And so in the report, the stated some of the findings there that we kind of will continue to enter the K-shaped economy, like beef protein, chicken has inflated 8% since last year, whereas pork and turkey has gone down. But again, animal protein is not necessarily the solution. So kind of like, what's your view on where the industry is headed?
Yeah, I mean, it is really an interesting challenge, and I think we've sort of seen a little bit of an ebb and flow in this area. I mean, it was people were quite excited, let's say around 2021, 2022, around the idea of alternative proteins, and I think people were kind of in a more adventuresome stage, maybe because of the geopolitical system or the economy, things like that were not such a distraction, and so people were willing to take some risks at that time, even with their diets and sort of in the interest of sort of the greater good, let's say. But I think, when it really comes down to it, food's a funny thing because, we all make decisions around food at least 3 times a day, right? If we're lucky. And it tends to be impulsive. So we tend to eat what is before us, what is, readily available. It's price driven, but it's also convenience driven. And so to try and prescribe what people will eat as an investor or even as a company that's producing a product, it's very challenging. I mean, ultimately, the people who really make decisions around what we eat are people who kind of control the supply chain, if you will. So if you look at big retailers and things like that, people tend to buy what's available, what's presented to them. And of course, there are marketing messages and things like that, and all those things play into why people make choices around the things that they eat. But at the end of the day, I mean, so much of it is really driven by sort of point of sale. What's available, what's readily available, and how convenient is it at the moment of decision around consumption. So when we think about the food system and we think about all of the challenges that the food system faces right now, as you say, I mean, we're looking at a global population that's by 2050. These numbers are not revealing because we all have heard them over and over again. But we're looking at a global population of 10 billion people. We're looking at a food industry today that is quite reliant on land and water, 2 resources that frankly don't scale. I mean, they can't continue to scale in ways that will be necessary to survive, to feed and nourish the global population using the same ingredients that we do today. So I mean that's the fundamental driver. But we're asking people to make choices today about populations of tomorrow, if you will. So you can't ask people to make choices today. I mean, you can ask them, but they're not inclined necessarily to make choices today, sacrifices today in the interest of those who will come after them. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that really at the end of the day, I mean, the solutions that we come up with today that make our food system more scalable and more sort of, let's say, economical in terms of land use and water use, and in terms of nutritional content and the ability to actually get product to market that consumers are willing to eat. We have to focus on the things that, let's say, make sense to industry. Because again, industry will produce products that will then make their way into channels like retail, and consumers will effectively buy what is presented to them in those venues. And so one of the areas that I think we'll see a lot more focus going forward is around things like strategic ingredients that go into foods. That require less land or less water, or are more economically grown. And when we talk about growing and we talk about economically growing, it gives rise to questions around, well, what goes into growing food in the first place, and are there food security related issues around those products.
So, the food system is very, very antiquated. And what I mean by this is, like, there's the food brokers, there's the group buys, there's listing services. So everything is kind of designed for scale. So if you're on an alternative food company, how do you get in? How do you change this system so there's greater variety? Because even if the consumers are demanding it, how do they get the products unless they get them into the big hands of, like, the big giants like Cisco? who have the ability to distribute this food to grocers?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think, first of all, no matter what it is, I mean, the food is substantially price driven. I mean, consumers make a lot of decisions around what they can afford, of course, and so as a result, that's what motivates a lot of the supply chain. They look at things that ultimately will be consumed, because one of the biggest challenges within the food system is really food waste, and
Mhm.
so shelf life and things like that and rotations become really, really important. So you don't want to put something on the shelf that's ultimately not going to sell, right? And particularly if it has a relatively
Yeah.
short shelf life. So a lot of the innovators, let's say, of let's say the last 5 years or so, were focused on producing products that didn't necessarily have long shelf lives. And the challenge there is that there's kind of a lag between consumers being presented with something and making the decision to actually embrace those products in their lifestyle. So going all the way back to the example of Beyond Meat, the products that they produce have a relatively short shelf life, right? So you need to bring consumers along uh, and warm them to the idea of the products that you're producing, such that they consume essentially what you produce, right? And with a company like Beyond Meat, its ability to produce and put product on the shelf is one part of the challenge, but the other part of the challenge is you need consumers that are willing to actually buy the product that you produce. And I think early on there was a belief, there was a general belief that kind of a build it and they will come mentality. And I think most of us believed that those products were sufficient for consumers to change their behavior and embrace those products and continue to support them as the business is scaled. Fact is, that's what we've of course learned, is that that's not actually what happened. And it's true of many different things. They're either fad driven, or price point is problematic, or the taste and the texture are not adequate. I mean, there's a whole host of things that
Mhm.
impact consumers' willingness to sort of go along with what you're producing and delivering through retail.
So if we're to double click on this as a case study, what were the hypotheses when you guys decided to invest in Beyond Meat, and what did you learn from the consumer expectations? Kind of like, where was the delta in the two?
Well, I think, I mean, to begin with, I mean, we had a mandate to support companies like that, right? To
Mhm.
change that narrative. And the reality is that there has been an uptake in plant-based foods, right? I mean, consumers are actually eating products today that didn't exist previously. And one of the things
Yeah.
about Beyond Meat is that Beyond Meat is really, I believe, is one of the companies that really actually jump-started people's excitement and enthusiasm around food tech and sort of alternative proteins, because
Mhm.
their IPO really caught people's imagination and attention, and it encouraged people
Mhm.
to try the product. So, I mean, it served a very, very important function in the course of kind of transforming the food system.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I think the expectations for that company sort of way outpaced where the market was actually at, and it continues to
Mhm.
be that. As of today, you look at market valuations and things like that. I mean, it was unfair to drive the valuation of Beyond Meat to where it ultimately soared
Yes.
to,
Yeah.
relative to what companies like that typically trade at on, in the marketplace under normal circumstances. So.
So speaking of valuations, how should founders think about valuations of food tech related companies? Should this be similar to a food related company, or should the valuation be more aligned with with the ability, the future potential, the scalability the food tech company presents?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, and I think to a certain extent, I mean, we always default to pricing things around the value of typical food companies.
Mm-hmm.
There may be more IP in there, and there may be something substantially disruptive about that technology that might give rise to a higher valuation. But the fact is that people are trained to think about food and food inputs and food manufacturing and things like that. So valuations will probably more closely track against regular food companies. I mean, if you look at things like, I mean, there's some certainly areas, biotech related food ingredient companies and things like that. They might tend to track on a slightly higher valuation, or things like high value nutraceuticals, things like that. It really depends on kind of what the subset of comparables really looks like. Because for some of these, there isn't an adequate subset of comparables. So if you take a company that's producing, a replacement for a milk protein, something like whey or something like lactoferrin or something like that, obviously you can't look at the traditional milk industry for valuation indices. So you're probably more likely to look at some, the way that it's being produced, and then price it according to the kind of technology that's being deployed.
So, with this context, what are the alternative foods that you're the most excited about? The things that you're watching out, the foods that consumers ought to be on the lookout or seek out?
I think increasingly, this is it's a great question, actually, because I think in the course of trying to produce more food more quickly, I mean, if I may, let me just step back for a minute. Where our food system really has its origins is in the Green Revolution, right? I mean, that's something that happened in the late 50s, early 60s. A guy named Borlaug sort of gave rise to this practice of creating, genetic species of crops that could withstand some of the traditional challenges of environment, of pestilence, and things like that. And that just resulted in enormous production capability. But the production capability was dependent on inputs, costly inputs like fertilizer and things like that. But it also led to monocropping, and it led to some of the things that people are afraid of today, like GMO and things like that. But the fact is that really was transformative. I mean, it really changed, global populations. It led to an abundance of food that really, kind of helped fuel the world's population growth as we know it today. And in the course of that sort of rapid growth, to a certain extent, food, those kinds of crops became sort of logical ingredients for a whole host of different things. And because they were so cheap to produce, and because they could be used, sort of deployed as synthetic ingredients that help to extend shelf life and things like that, what we wound up doing is we wound up taking our eyes off things like flavor and nutrient and nutrient density and things like that. So that gave rise to firms that were producing flavors. So the flavors, now there are flavoring companies that actually produce flavors that help to add flavoring to products that normally would have tasted like, let's say, a poultry, like a chicken. Frequently, chicken products actually will wind up with synthetic flavoring that help to recreate that flavor of chicken, because in the haste to grow these creatures or these crops, what's happened is actually the nutrients that would normally take, let's say, 6 months to embed themselves because of the accelerated growth process. Those nutrients are not embedded, nor are the flavors and things like that would come along with it. So so the point is that, what we're missing today is we're missing, good flavored products. We're missing a lot of the nutrients, the micronutrients that we formerly were dependent upon. And consumers are looking for those nutrients, but what we don't understand is how those nutrients are actually absorbed in the body. So health claims are a way that producers can advertise that their products contain all of the nutrients that are that consumers may be looking for.
Yeah.
But the reality is that those nutrients may not actually be digestible or accessible. They call it bioavailability. There may not be bioavailability in your own body to absorb those kinds of nutrients. So that space is becoming very, very interesting. And one of the things that's really kind of spurred people's interest in that space is the GLP-1 craze that's kicked off about, let's say, 24 months ago. And with that, what doctors are recognizing is that people are losing weight, which is wonderful. But what they're also losing is they're losing muscle mass. They require more fiber, more protein. They tend to be, I won't say malnourished, nourished, but they don't have the kinds of nourishment that's required. So this has given rise to a whole industry of what are called companion foods that sit alongside GLP-1, and that people should be eating in order to get the kind of nutrients and nourishment that they need, given this sudden change in diet. So, I mean, these kinds of things are interesting. There's another area that's become really, really popular and very interesting, and that is active nutrition, active aging. Many of the economies in the world, you're seeing aging populations. People want to live a healthier, longer life, and so they're starting to focus more and more on things like nutrition and specific products that will help to lead to longevity.
So is your talking, couple of thoughts come to mind. So I live half of my life in Europe, half of my life in Canada, and as you know, in Europe there's a lot of ingredients that are banned in the United States or Canada, and food just tastes different in Europe versus in the States. So it's almost like there's the economy. Flavor is almost, at least from my perspective, diametrically opposed to scale. In Europe, it's a lot more common to find farms, and it's a lot more common to find polycultures. And in the United States or Canada, it's a lot more common to find mass farms and monocultures. So kind of like, how can we bridge the divide and, drive better food, better quality ingredients, or higher caloric value, or better tasting food here in North America? Is it a situation of building almost companion farming to like gas plants, where we can use the ambient energy or the stranded energy to produce food? Kind of like, what does the future look like from a food production perspective?
Well, I guess it really depends on what kind of food production we're talking about. I mean, I think, look, I'm whether it's vegetables or whether it's animal proteins. I mean, I think price will drive a lot of
Decisions.
The decisions certainly around if you look at beef prices have been rising steadily. And that's given rise to conversations and to a certain extent some action around blended let's say beef mince, for example, you're starting to hear more and more about, blends, which is kind of interesting because, if you went back, 20 years, we were eating many more blended meat products then than we are today, in part because of that. I don't know if you recall, but the health scare in the UK over mad cow disease and things like that. So I think to a certain extent, there was a good reason why we sort of went back to, kind of pure meat consumption, around, let's say beef, or the product that you believed that you were eating. It was largely comprised of that. But I think today there's a compelling reason to look at blends. One of the compelling reasons is obviously cost. Another one is actually health. If you blend, beef minced with let's say a soy ingredient, you're reducing the fat content, and you're introducing, what is essentially a similar digestible protein. In other words, there's something called the PD-Cas rating, which is the digestibility of protein, and soy and beef are on par. So it's not like you're making a sacrifice in terms of your nutritional needs. In fact, you're actually getting a very similar profile. So, but if you look at things like, whether it's vegetables, things like that, I think it's we what we are consuming today as consumers, and we're talking a lot about what consumers do and consume and things like that. We're talking very much about a Western sort of let's say OECD type, highly developed economy. But I think what you find is that we've been exposed to many different varieties of foods from all over the world, and so our dietary repertoire is much broader than it was historically, and that's particularly true in diverse countries like North America, Canada, and the United States, where you have people from all over the world. There's a much broader sort of a dietary expectation, around consumers who've come from many different places. So in Europe, one of the reasons why food is good is because a lot of times food is local, and the reason it's local is because that hits people's local interests and desires and expectations. So, and France is a particularly notorious country, for example. People want to buy stuff that is produced in France, but part of the reason why is because they want the kinds of foods that they're used to. And that's certainly not the case in places like Paris. But if you go to North America, you've got a much broader population of people from different parts of the world, and those expectations are even more varied. And the expectation is that those products will probably have come from afar to arrive. And in fact, in some ways, they're looking for things that come from the home country, let's say, wherever that may be, right? So the point is that there's not that same resistance to products that have come from afar.
So, where I live in Canada, it doesn't even matter where you go. Even if you go into the biggest grocers, they would have international sections with, foods from the Philippines or Mexico or wherever in the world. It's almost it's so normal that you don't even think about it. I'm almost of the opinion that they would stop branding it as international and just kind of brand it as I don't know, curries or rice or whatever it might be like. I want to get your perspective on something, because you were talking about blends. Even in North America, even in Canada, we're starting to see cricket farms and alternative protein coming in vogue. But obviously, for us here in North America, there's a bit of an ick factor about this. Protein is protein from my perspective. Is the key to drive increased adoption of alternative protein to just blend it, kind of like your example around blended meats or blended products? Is this a way to increase the I don't know, the adoption of alternative protein?
First of all, I'm hanging a little bit on a comment you made a minute ago, which is, that protein is protein.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Okay. Protein is certainly not protein. I mean, different proteins carry with them different attributes and different nutritional benefits. Let's say, I'm a vegetarian as it happens. Really as a result of my investment focus, but I routinely am missing out on heme iron, for example. And the source of heme iron, the primary source of heme iron is meat, right?
Okay.
So if my doctor prescribes to me heme iron pills, probably the origin is of animal origin, right? So there are sometimes types of protein that deliver things that you just need that you can't get anywhere else. So if you talk about things like crickets, like insects and things, yeah, there's an ick factor, absolutely, and that is, again, that is a protein that does, it probably has a PDCAS1, meaning that it's bioavailable. You can consume it, and you use it. It delivers, the amino acids and things like that you're requiring, but.
Mm-hmm.
The ick factor is important, right? I mean, it's a bridge too far for many, many people. And so as a result, if you look at the industry, to use those proteins as an ingredient in food, there are things that make it challenging for a producer. So if I'm looking to use it as a blend, for example, I want to look at proteins that don't have any off nodes, that have a texture that works and that simulates. That's very similar to let's say what I'm trying to blend it with. And not all proteins function in the same. Can be applied to any application, right? So if you look at insects, what insects have proven to be best suited for is for things like fish feed or animal feed, things like that. And so that's really where they've found most of their market, because they struggle to find a place in the human consumption.
Mm-hmm.
But some of it might be because they have an off node, and that off node needs to be masked, and the masking that they use to hide the off node, that flavorant, can be quite expensive. So in a plant-based product, the flavoring could be anywhere from, let's say, 30 to 45% of the cost. So it's quite expensive.
Okay. So if I heard you say price and input is probably the two biggest determinants of mass adoption, what would drive the cost down? How should food tech companies think about driving the cost down in order to get the price more closely aligned with what traditional food sources costs are? And where does government support play a role? Because I mean, we know that a lot of the agriculture system is on a quota, or it's heavily subsidized by the government.
Yeah. Also a good question. I mean, I think subsidy is certainly a problem. And if conceptually, if you were to compare a soy burger, let's say, with a beef burger, intuitively you would believe that the soy burger, being of plant origin and with requiring much less inputs and things like that, it should be much cheaper. But the fact is it's not, and part of that is definitely attributable to scale, for sure. And part of that is there is a subsidy element to it. But I think ultimately the subsidy angle is kind of less than you might think.
Okay.
We've used that argument for years, and actually the reality is I don't think it's quite as large as what we imagine it is. I think a big part of the problem is one of scale. There just isn't adequate scale, and consumers, the consumption of let's say maybe 80% of the population is willing to eat meat, where only 20% is eating plant-based, something like that. And so as a result, you can see that you just can't produce to the kind of scale that would be necessary in order to bring down costs. So that's one thing. But I think governments. I think if you look at how long it takes, if some of these food companies to gestate, that when you a completely new concept like cultured meat, for example, that could be an intergenerational endeavor. It's going to take a long time to get that kind of production to be able to scale to a level where it's actually going to have an impact on the industrial animal protein industry. But it makes a lot of sense. The only way that it can possibly get there is through government subsidies. And governments have kind of ebbed and flowed on that. If you look at here in the Netherlands, the government has been fairly supportive of companies like Mosa Meat in trying to help to foster the industry. But it's a relatively small industry, looking to produce a kind of scale that really would need to be able to make some kind of an impact in the traditional slaughterhouse route that produces meat today.
So I appreciate your comment. If we're thinking about a sequence of events that need to take place for this trend to accelerate, what are these dominoes? I mean, you certainly talked about scale. You talked about government support. You talked about consumer demand. Kind of like, what is the tipping scale? What would cause or what would lead to the alternative food industry getting to the same level of scale to drive the same price comparity to traditional food sources? What's your perspective like?
I mean, we're talking about food. I mean, there's a lot of different foods, right? I mean, so I guess that's part of the reason why we've been so focused on protein, because protein is really one of the most critical to change in order to really change, certainly from an environmental perspective, or from a land usage perspective and things like that. I mean, I think it's a big one to address. Look, I think part of the problem is that the quality of the products that are on market today, consumers' expectations aren't satisfied by the products that are on the market. So if you look at plant-based foods, whether it's Beyond Meat or Impossible Burgers. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to eat an Impossible Burger, but I can think of a myriad applications for, let's say, ground beef, where if I were to substitute ground beef with ground Impossible, you simply wouldn't know the difference. I mean, you wouldn't know. And so I think to a certain extent, there needs to be some openness on the part of consumers to the idea that frequently meat is an ingredient. Meat is not, a center of the plate end in itself. And I think, and part of it is consumers, and part of it is also food service. I'm an investor in a company down in Indonesia, for example. And in Indonesia, consumers, as you pointed out at the beginning of the show, meat alternatives have been around for 1,000 years.
Mhm.
In Asia in particular, they eat what they refer to as mock meats and things like that, soy-based meat analogs. They're not something new. But what is new is this new advent of actually sort of creating a meat analog that looks like meat and functions like specifically like a meat replacement. That's not something that's been around for thousands of years. And so we did launch this company in Southeast Asia. It's had some successes. It's got a good following,
Mhm.
but but the consumer, the CPG side of the business is not adequate to keep the company going. I mean, it
Mhm.
performs okay in retail, but we just don't get the same kind of traction in a market where people are really aspiring to animal meat, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Something they haven't, as the country becomes wealthier, people want to eat more meat, and so
Yeah.
that's not a new concept. So that's what we're competing against. But if you approach the food service providers, the Sodexos world or the Compasses, these
Yeah.
big food service companies that are doing things like feeding students in schools or government
Yeah.
offices or corporate campuses or fulfilling major orders for let's say even things like airlines and stuff like that. Um, if you talk to them about producing meals, what they're thinking about is how do I produce a tasty meal at scale, cheaper,
Mhm. Of
cheaper
course.
per meal, right? So
Mhm.
you introduce the idea of a blended product to them, and if it's a blended ingredient that all they have to do is tear open the bag and dump it in and mix it with the beef or the
Yeah.
chicken,
Yeah.
um, they're going to listen. They're definitely going to listen to what you have to say. So what we found is that actually we've produced something that we call economical protein. It's a pre-texturized, pre-flavored ingredient that we sell through food service,
Mhm.
and people love it. Hotels, hotel chains. I mean, we just I think yesterday the company was telling me that they pitched to 120 general managers for a hotel chain in Southeast Asia. Um, and even just to get that audience, I mean, you've got to have something that they're interested in. Otherwise, you're not going to get you know,
Attention.
their attention, right? So the point is that I think um, again, coming all the way back to the point that I was trying to make, if people are willing to first and foremost look at the applications of meat where it's simply an ingredient and not a center of the plate replacement,
Mhm.
then I think what they might be open to is the idea that actually meat analogs can function well in those applications. But
Mhm.
whenever
Mhm.
somebody says they think about replacing a piece of steak with a piece of plant-based meat, and
Yeah.
it's not a one for one replacement. It's not even a one
Yeah.
for. I mean, it's just not it's not the same thing. But there are certainly plenty of applications where a plant-based meat analog
Yeah.
can serve the purpose, and without any appreciable loss, as far as I'm concerned. And that's something that we need
That
to
makes
work.
sense. What so have you guys done any kind of calculations in terms of what would this mean from a sustainability perspective if more companies, particularly let's say the food services industry, followed by the hospitality industry, if they were to adopt more alternative protein, kind of what's the impact?
I think if you're interested in some of those kinds of numbers, what I would steer you toward is
Yeah.
the Good Food Institute. They publish all sorts of information
Okay.
around sort of the potential impact of that kind of transition. It's a really interesting site. I mean, it's
Mhm.
a very interesting organization. The founder of the Good Food Institute is a guy named Bruce Friedrich, and Bruce used to be one of the
Okay.
trustees of the New Crop Capital Trust that we started investing
Okay.
early on. So yeah, quite an interesting guy.
Fantastic. Speaking of the fun again, if a food tech founder is listening to this podcast episode, um, What should they pitch you? How should they pitch you? Where do they find you? I mean, you're one of the largest food tech investors, so it's probably not that hard to find you. But kind of like, what does an ideal pitch look like to you?
Well, I mean, first of all, as you mentioned, I'm based in Amsterdam. I'm in the Netherlands, and I came over here in 2018, in part because a lot of people don't know this, but the Netherlands is the second or third largest exporter of food worldwide. It's a little tiny country, but it's a very food focused. Has one of the leading food tech universities. Wageningen University is, UC Davis in
Mm-hmm.
California. It's
Full wine.
one of
Yeah.
the leading agricultural universities in the world.
Yeah.
And so it seemed like a sensible place to set up, particularly to focus on Europe and Asia, and also, kind of the technology flow between and among, sort of North American countries and Europe. And it's proven to be very interesting. We raised our second fund here, raised about 150 million euros, substantially from foreign investors. I say foreign, from European and Asian investors, as well as North American investors. But and many of them were industrial investors, so companies that wanted to use us essentially as a CVC, a corporate venture arm. We help to source deals for them that might be of interest based on their mandates. But anyway, so I'm raising a third fund here in Europe, and this one is really looking more at growth stage companies. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I just was responding to a post on LinkedIn today about there was somebody pointing out that there's a real dearth, a genuine dearth of seed capital, early capital, focused on actually focused on all sorts of technologies in Southeast Asia. It's really been a drop off in early stage investing. And I think that drop off in early stage investing, I mean, to a certain extent, you have to recognize that things like interest rates are much higher today than they were, back when we raised our second fund in 2021, 2022. And so, there's an economic reason why people aren't necessarily willing to part with money and take more risk, with early stage companies. But I think there's also another point, and that is that, whether it's clean tech or whether it's food tech, policy plays a really important role in the likely success of these companies. But also the gestation period for a lot of these companies is very long. So if you're investing in very early stage companies, you're looking at a 10 to potentially 15-year investment hold period, which is that's much longer than a typical venture fund. Venture fund is 10 years, so 5-year investment period, and then a 5-year divestment period. So so if you're looking for investors right now, I think one of the best things that you can do is and be at a point where you're nearly self-sustaining in terms of your revenue, so you're not burning a lot of cash on working capital, and you're actually in the market for investment, so that you can scale your technology, or so that you can access some logical milestones that sort of might align with a timeline that makes more sense for venture investment.
Makes sense. I know that we're coming close to the end of the show, Kim. If somebody's looking to get in touch with you, what's the best way? Do they go to Unovis website, LinkedIn? Kind of, how do they get in touch with you?
They can find me on LinkedIn. I do respond to inquiries on LinkedIn.
Okay.
Because certainly they can go to my website as well, but and I'm not sure if we actually have email addresses on our website, but yeah, LinkedIn is a good place, I think.
That's good. And if there's no emos on the website, it's even better because then it weeds out the people that are really interested. Because if you want to find an emo, you can. It just takes effort.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I certainly don't mind sharing my email. But I mean, again, we're really looking at increasingly we're looking more at growth stage companies.
Any particular geography that's of high interest in terms of the growth stage companies?
Well, it's funny you should ask. I mean, you're based in Canada. We've got companies in Canada, and Canada's a very interesting market right now. They're trying to woo a lot of investment into Canada and the food system. There's a lot of kind of exchange between Canada and Europe right now. So Canada is a market of interest. Here in Europe is our primary focus, as well as Asia. I mean, technically we're global. We'll look at things almost anywhere. But at the end of the day, I mean, probably the bulk of what we'll wind up doing is in places where we can where we're in a position to provide support and ongoing interaction.
Yeah.
I have two investments out in Asia. I mentioned one is in China, and one is down in Indonesia, and it's pretty tricky to try and manage those investments as loan investments. So to have a few more investments in Asia would be helpful, but to have investments in southern Latin America would be challenging, for example. The question is, where can we add the most value? How can we use our network, and how can we use our community to add value to the companies that we invest in?
So you're based out of Amsterdam, and Europe is known for policies and regulations, even in some cases maybe overreaching. But when it comes to food, I mean, I remember 2 years ago they introduced the Common Agricultural Policy reform. Like, they're continuously tweaking things. Do you see Europe as kind of the leading force in terms of like the evolution in terms of how we think about food, or what's coming from a food perspective?
I think I can't speak to Canada, but I can certainly say that I think I feel as though Europe is much more responsible, not only about sort of ensuring the safety of the food that people eat, but also looking out for kind of long-term stress points and things like climate and food security and things like that. Those are much bigger issues, I think, for Europe. And so you have to create policy frameworks around them in ways that let's say North America is just not driven by some of those same same motivations. If you look at the regulatory environment, I mean, some say it's just too restrictive here, but actually, and in fact, it is a very, very challenging environment if you're trying to get a novel ingredient approved, for sure. But the opposite extreme is the United States, where you just walk in and declare it. You self-declared, generally recognized as safe. So I think there's quite an extreme, and if you look at where it's particularly interesting is if you look at the challenges that American companies have trying to get their products into Europe, and how many of those products have to be reformulated in order to sell in this market, because in the formulation that they sell in the United States are just not deemed to be healthy.
Yeah, understood. Makes sense. Kim, I know that you focus on Europe and Asia. Is there a colleague of yours that focuses on Canada? We're based out of Canada, so naturally a lot of our podcast listeners and followers are from Canada. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of organizations like the Bioenterprise Corporation, the Canada Commercial Corporation. There's a lot of organizations here in Canada that are focusing on the things that you're describing. If a Canadian founder is listening, do they reach out to you? Do they reach out to another colleague of yours?
No, you can reach out to me, but actually we have a food tech company based in British Columbia, in Vancouver. Okay. It's a company called Cultivated Food Labs.
Okay.
Very, very interesting company, and actually he'd be an interesting one for you to have a conversation with as
I
well.
would love that. I would love that. What we're
Joel
trying to do it.
name. Yeah.
Do you mind-
What's that?
Do you mind making email introductions?
I'd be more than happy to. Yeah.
Okay.
He's an interesting guy. I think Joel would be an interesting one for you to talk to.
Yeah, I would love it. I mean, British Columbia is a really, really interesting province. Yes, it's got beautiful mountains, but it's got a lot of farm production. And obviously, most people, from a agriculture perspective, most people associate British Columbia with the wine industry, with viticulture, and it has some of the best wines in the world. Obviously, the cost of production is massively higher than, let's say, buying a wine in Spain. But the quality is on par. The quality is amazing. And so the government is trying very hard to introduce this. One interesting company there is, I'm drawing a blank on the company name, but essentially they use once the grapes are pressed, they use the byproduct that's left, the grape skins, and they turn this into a food product that, it's kind of to your point, it's additive. It's not in isolation, but it's additive to the food supply and to enhance flavors, for coloring. And so they do really, really well.
Interesting. Yeah, very interesting.
Okay. I know. I'll mention Unovis to them and see if they might be of interest. It was a real pleasure to talk to you, Kim. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights on food. Super excited about where the food industry is headed, and hopefully consumers are the driving force behind the change and evolution in what we consume and how we consume it.
Indeed. Okay, thanks, Max. I appreciate the time. It was really interesting talking.